Hey, what's up everybody? Thunderbob here, and tonight we are going to talk about The Outer Worlds 2. I just finally finished the game and I've really enjoyed the experience. I think the output of Obsidian Entertainment has really been strong for the last few years. I liked but did not love the first Outer Worlds, and I think Avowed took that formula and made it work in a fantasy setting and was even better than the Outer Worlds. And now that same year we get the Outer Worlds 2, which has improved the formula even further. That's not to say the game's perfect, and we're going to talk about a few of the minor issues I had, but overall, I really loved this game. And we're going to start out talking about the story and characters, which I think is one of the strongest elements in this game. And this is a sequel, but you don't really need knowledge of the first game to pick it up. It takes place in the same fictional universe, but it's a different colony. This time it's in Arcadia rather than the Halcyon colony, and it's an entirely new cast of characters, and just has a few kind of connective tissue with that first game. And you're an Earth Directorate operative whose job is basically to keep the corporations and other entities in check in these distant colonies, where there is no de facto government. It's all kind of run by the corporations and the different organizations. In the opening mission, you're betrayed and you end up in suspended animation for a decade, and that's where the game picks up. And you come in and you start to unravel what happened in that last 10 years between the different factions in this deteriorated state of the world, as these colonies are cut off from Earth and largely dependent on themselves. And right away, I'll say the story is a lot more nuanced and told in a better way than the first game, which pretty much just every corporation in that first game was the most evil and profit-focused entity, and it was really hard to find any redeeming qualities about them. You know, that was the joke, and it largely worked in that first game, but here the factions feel a bit more realistic. They're still generally concerned with their own success, but they're not as maniacally, laughingly evil about it. I think the game is better for having a bit more nuanced take on the different factions. And there is, of course, a world-ending threat that you slowly unravel as you try to track down this individual who betrayed you at the beginning. You meet a ton of factions, and you can mediate their differences through diplomacy, or shoot your way through a ton of quests and missions, and the narrative largely worked for me. You can pick up a crew of 6 companions, and you generally get one from each of the major factions in the game, and almost all of them start out with some kind of beef with one of the other members of your crew, and even some of them have issues with their home faction, and through a ton of dialogue and some really interesting character-focused missions, you can guide their personalities in some pretty interesting ways, such as helping a cultist come to terms with the fact that all of her beliefs are a lie, or you might be able to convince that corporate shill that who adores her corporation that they might not actually have her best interest in mind. And overall, I like the characters better in the second game. Like, I liked a couple of the characters in the first game, but overall, I wasn't that impressed with your companion. In this game, you get, basically one character from each of the major factions, and it really helps you understand the different groups in the game world. And also, nearly all of these characters are just absolute badasses and are essentially like the best of the best from their given faction. The companion quests are some of the best in the game, and I really suggest finishing them all as they flesh out the backstories of a lot of your characters and the world and how the different factions connect and what they all mean. And overall, I like the story better in Outer World 2. I think it came together in a much more cohesive fashion, and I think all the way up to the end, it was quite meaningful, and you get some really cool choices at the end, like in traditional kind of Bethesda style. You get that montage of different choices you've made, and there's probably like 20 different clips that can play out in just numerous ways. And just from my one playthrough, I could see how you could have just an absolutely different ending depending on the choices you made. And beyond the story and the characters, the gameplay is also a lot stronger than the first game. And I don't just mean the shooting, but let's start there. You get just a huge variety of weapons and tools to take down the enemies, from pistols to sniper rifles to melee weapons and more exotic weapons like my corrosive pistol, or I've got a cannon that shoots out like these exploding tumors. And you unlock a bunch of tools that let you do things like slow down time, disintegrate enemy bodies, see through walls, rocket jump, and more. And each of them are really smartly used both in combat and puzzle solving and for navigating the game world. There's also a crafting system to create ammo and modify your weapons and armor. The modding system feels a bit half-baked though, as every weapon type requires a different mod, and there's just so many weapon types. By the end of the game, there were a bunch of weapons that I just never found any usable mods on, even though they had mod slots. And with this huge pool of weapons and tools available, the gunplay is considerably improved over the first game, or some of the other games that inspired it, like Fallout 3 and 4 and New Vegas. But it still falls short of some of the best shooters on the market, in my opinion. And beyond the combat, there's just a ton of ways to interact with the world and progress through the game. You can talk your way through a lot of encounters and avoid fights with stealth or open up new paths using lockpicking and hacking. And, when you create your character, you're going to pick an initial background that impacts how characters react to you, and it pops up frequently in conversation. There's also 12 skills that run the typical gamut for this type of game, including guns, melee, hacking, lockpicking, leadership, medical, observation, science, sneak, and speech. And they're used to interact with the puzzles and the world, and also frequently impact interactions and conversation with other characters. The problem is you only get 2 skill points per level. And with a level cap of 30, you can only max out like 3 of these skills unless you pick the easily distracted flaw, which will give you a 3rd point per level, but that means you're not going to be able to max out any of your skills. And the flaw system is really interesting. It's basically like a random perk you receive through gameplay that has a both positive and negative impact. For example, you might use your inhaler a lot, which is your healing item, and then you get a flaw that pops up, and it makes it more efficient, but then because you're dependent on it, you're not able to use it quite as frequently. Or I found another one where if you skip dialogue a lot, you can select this flaw where you only have 15 seconds to select your dialogue, but you receive more experience. So it's kind of like a trade-off. And I ended up taking quite a few of these flaws, and they really did impact my build in really interesting ways. I would suggest, taking the more fun-looking ones, and there are some that can just break your game, so be careful what you select. And beyond the skills, beyond the flaws, there's also the perk system. Every other level you get a perk point, which largely impacts the gameplay. Everything from improving your combat prowess to the ability to pickpocket enemies to having improved, speech options. There's just a ton of perks. You end up getting about 15, I think, by the end of the game, and they very substantially change the way you play. And there are just a ton of hard skill checks in the game, and there's no way to raise those skills outside of skill points, unlike the first game where you could have items that would impact that. And it really forces you to think about your choices and gives you some incentive to replay the game if you want to see everything. But it can also feel pretty limiting. These systems all work together well to give you a huge amount of customization for your character, but also really forces you to specialize your character where you end up spreading your points too thin and you might miss on some of these skill checks. And after beating the game, I'll say there were very few areas that I could not access with my build, and generally the things locked down to a specific skill like hacking or lockpicking just provided resources rather than being like a major story element or giving you like a unique weapon. There are a few conversations and endings that are locked behind pretty hard skill checks, however, and you don't know that until you reach that point. So you can't like save scum, and there's no way to impact those skill levels. So you can sometimes feel a little cheated. If you don't build your character correctly, you get to a point and it's like, oh, I guess I'm just not going to be able to pass this skill check, and I'm going to get a bad ending to this quest. Also, by about halfway through the game, I really felt overpowered. And I wish I invested a little bit more in the skills and perks that impacted the skill checks rather than just combat. I was really heavily combat focused in the early part of the game, and I ended up being kind of overpowered by the end, I felt. Overall, the gameplay works because of the really fun combination of, this great combat, the environmental and character interactions, and just this really, really fun world to explore. And speaking of that game world, there are 4 main different planets to explore, along with a couple of space stations and some smaller sub-locations. And I really love kind of the balance that Obsidian has been able to create with these games. It's like they took the general structure of Fallout, but they're able to condense that huge open world into a couple of mid-sized planets to explore. They're smaller, but much more dense with things to find and explore, and it really makes me want to search out and reveal the entire map, find every secret and mission, and there are plenty of quests spread around the world, and most of them are multi-step and much more complex than just go kill those spiders over there. They often have a lot of dialogue, choices to be made, and often you have multiple factions to side with, and who you pick may impact later missions and also the end of the game. And at this point, I've explored nearly every square inch of the world and completed the majority of the missions, except for a couple that I locked myself out of, either by picking, there's certain points where you have to pick one side or the other, and you can lock yourself out of missions. Or there's a couple of missions that I feel like I might have bugged out and I could never finish. And let's talk about that. This game has some bugs. I had a mostly stable experience, but I ran into a few issues throughout my 50 or so hours. Some of these were just cosmetic, like guns being invisible. I had my leg just disappear at one point in my character screen. I had some weird animation issues, like, background characters when you're talking to an NPC kind of bugging out. Others are more game impacting, like having a mission break and being unable to complete one of the major side story missions, and it ended up impacting my ending pretty largely. There's been a few patches since I beat the game, so some of these may have been addressed, but I had at least 2 quests that appear to have been bugged and I could never finish. So there are some bugs, but it's not, I'm going to say it's not to the Bethesda level, like when Skyrim or Oblivion or, those games have hundreds and hundreds of bugs. I'd say there's a handful that I ran into. And overall, I'm going to say I like the look of the game. It's not the most technically advanced game in the world, but it has a great art direction with just a lot of color and a lot of character to all of these worlds. And each of the worlds feels very unique. It has its own flora and fauna, has a very different color pattern, palette, and a different feeling. So I really like the look of the game. Each world is so unique. It made me want to explore every square inch of it. Performance was a bit mixed for me on my PC. I've got a 3080, and I was able to get close to a locked 60 FPS with mid settings and DLSS enabled. But occasionally my performance would crater until I'd restart. I think there might be a memory leak somewhere. And also some of the areas are more demanding than others. So like I might play for 2 hours and hit 60 frames per second constantly, and I go to a new location and suddenly I'm hitting like 45. And, just some of these seem more optimized or more demanding than others. Yeah, so final thoughts. I really enjoyed The Outer World 2, and as a evolution of Obsidian's kind of Fallout-inspired RPGs, I really like where this is going. The combat, the story, the interactions with the characters, and the world are all really well realized. Outside of a few bugs and, perhaps some overly restrictive character options, I don't have many complaints. If you're looking for what is essentially Fallout in space and you bounce it off of Starfield, you want something that's a little bit more closely related to the Bethesda old school RPGs, you should probably check this out and let me know what you think. I really enjoyed it, and I think if you are a fan of Fallout, if you liked the original Outer Worlds, this is just a better version of that game, and you don't necessarily need to finish that first game to understand what's going on here. So I'm going to end the video there. I do want to thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this, like, subscribe, and drop me a comment with any thoughts. Have a good night, everybody.